Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. If you listened to Monday's podcast, you could probably tell by the tone of my voice and the fact that it was only a 40-minute podcast that I was pretty down in the dumps. And it really had to do with not so much the shootings, which, of course, anytime there's a mass shooting or there's a tragedy in our country, because of everything that I've seen through my years as the general counsel at FEMA, as the deputy director and director of FEMA, as the undersecretary of Homeland Security, I've seen a lot of death and destruction. But when it happens in your own country and you, excuse me, and you see the kind of vitriolic rhetoric that comes out blaming the president, I mean, actually saying that the president pulled the trigger. I read a tweet that said that if you are a member of any sort of gun rights organization like the NRA or any of the others, or that if you support them in any way, that all of you unequivocally have blood on your hands. And as I read through all of that on Sunday and Monday, and watched the TV shows, listened to the news coverage, it really became discouraging. It became discouraging because there is no attempt on the left to have a rational conversation about what needs to be done. And I think the reason there's no impetus, motivation, desire, however you want to describe it, to have any sort of rational conversation on the left is because of one simple fact. And I think this would cause some people who are listening to say, well, now, Michael, you're being irrational and you're refusing to be compromising or open-minded or anything else. So be it. I believe from the bottom of my heart, depths of my soul, that these tragedies are used by the left, first and foremost, to incrementally get us to the point where the nation as a whole is so tired of the violence and is so tired of the shootings that the nation is willing to, okay, I just give up. I give up. Do you want to do X? Do you want to do Y? I'll do just about anything in order to get you to shut up or to let you try something if you think it's going to reduce gun violence. And the problem is, all of the solutions that these organizations and the left writ large offer is really a path toward either gun confiscation or severe limitations on the ability to own and use a firearm, to somehow shift the responsibility of protecting yourself from yourself to law enforcement, the government, or somebody else, to a third party. They want to take that right away. Now, I truly believe that they sincerely believe that some sort of gun control will actually reduce the amount of violence in the country. I think they believe that. I think they're full of crap. I want to go to an article, an editorial. I know most of you don't, and I totally understand this, that most of you don't spend the kind of money that it takes to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. But because I've been an avid reader of the Wall Street Journal for most of my entire adult life, from the time I was in college all the way to now, I do spend the money so that I can read the editorial page, so I can read their news coverage. So it gives me, certainly, and I know the editorial page is right of center most of the time, and that the news reporting, other than perhaps the financial reporting, tends to be left of center. I recognize that. But I think the reporting is much more accurate, much more objective. And the editorial page, while I don't always agree with everything the editorial page says, I usually find something, even in the house editorials that are written by the editorial board, not by any one individual, that they have something that is worth thinking about. Such is the case with an editorial that appeared late in the online edition of the Wall Street Journal. Now, I will tell you up front that there are a couple of paragraphs, there are 4 paragraphs, I think, to be precise, in this editorial that I do not agree with, and in fact, I think is an attempt by the editorial board to keep the attention not only of people like me, but to try to keep the attention of people on the left that they're really aiming at. And so if they don't throw them a bone, they're not going to stop and think about it. So let me tell you what this editorial said, because with the exception of those 4 paragraphs, I think it pretty accurately sums up the actual problem of gun violence. The editorial board writes, "The mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton over the weekend are horrifying assaults on peaceful communities by disturbed young men. American politics will try to simplify these events into a debate about guns or political rhetoric. But the common theme of these killings is the social alienation of young men that will be harder to address." That's exactly why I think the left, because they have an ulterior motive, they really do want to limit firearms and access to firearms, even by law-abiding citizens like you and me. I also think the left doesn't want to deal with what the Wall Street Journal just called the social alienation of young men that will be harder to address. One response to reject is the reflex to blame these shootings on political opponents. Before noon on Sunday, we received an email from the Progressive Democrats of America declaring that, quote, "We blame President Trump for feeding into the anti-immigrant frenzy and white supremacist violence. Yes, you, Mr. President, had your finger on that AK-47, close quote." Your Honor, I rest my case. I got dozens of emails from Democrats, probably every single one, because I'm on all these Democrat mailing lists, from, I think, virtually every single Democrat running for president. I got one from Gabby Giffords. I got one from Moms Demand Action, all talking about how President Trump has blood on his hands, as do those conservatives and Republicans who support him and support organizations like the NRA. I have zero blood. Well, I actually have blood on my hand from a blister from doing some yard work last weekend, but I have zero blood on my hands. I have no responsibility whatsoever for what either of those 2 young men did, either in Dayton or in El Paso. And to try to put blood on my hands is an affront to me that I won't stand. Now, I want to skip the 4 paragraphs that I think are an attempt to mollify those on the left. And I want to get to the crux of what the Wall Street Journal is really trying to get across. Remember, I think the money quote is, "The common theme of these killings is the social alienation of young men that will be harder to address." The Wall Street Journal editorial continues that one place for leaders to focus, as we've long argued, is mental health. This is a matter of policy more than money. Health and Human Services Mental Health Division projects mental health spending from all sources, public and private, will be about $238 billion in 2020, up from $147 billion in 2009. I would just note parenthetically, that's a pretty significant increase from $147 billion to $238 billion. The Wall Street Journal continues that mental health is an essential benefit under Obamacare, and California passed a 1% income tax surcharge expressly for mental health. The problem, the journal writes, is identifying those with mental illness who are a threat and then allowing society to intervene to prevent violence. Overwhelming evidence suggests that the deinstitutionalization of the seriously mentally ill has had tragic results. Libertarians and mental health advocates who resist such intervention need to do some soul searching. Then they try to mollify those on the left by talking about red flag bills, such as the one in Colorado, which, in my opinion, would not have stopped either of these killings, and which are going to end up getting law enforcement killed because of the way they operate. But then they go back to the point that I think is the crux that nobody wants to address. The Wall Street Journal writes, which brings us back to the angry young men. This is the one common element in nearly all mass shootings. 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz in Parkland, Florida. Chris Harper Mercer in Oregon's Umpqua Community College. Adam Lanza at Newtown, Connecticut. Devin Patrick Kelly in Sutherland Springs, and the rest. All were deeply troubled and alienated from society in our increasingly atomistic culture. This is one price we are paying for the decline in what the late sociologist Peter Berger called the meditating institutions that help individuals form cultural and social attachments. These are churches, business and social clubs like the Rotary, charitable groups, even bowling leagues, and especially the family. The journal writes, government programs can never replace these as protectors of troubled young people. Recognizing this reality, they write, is not a counsel of despair to do nothing about mass shootings, but revitalizing these private institutions of social capital is crucial to reversing the cultural decline at the root of so many of America's ills. To kind of put the icing on the cake, 22% of millennials say they have no friends. No friends. The millennial generation, ages 23 to 38. Those are the years, I think back to when I was between the ages of 23 to 38. Those were indeed prime years of careers taking off for me, starting a family. And then, of course, after that, your joints begin to ache and you start to get older. But as a recent poll and some corresponding research indicate, there really is something missing for many in this generation. And that's one word: companionship. A YouGov poll found that 30%, one-third, let's just round it up, one-third of millennials say they feel lonely. And that is the highest percentage of all the generations surveyed. In total, if you take all generations, millennials, Generation X, baby boomers, the average over all of those generations is 21%. Just about a fifth have no friends and feel lonely. But among millennials, that's 30%. Generation X, it drops to 20%. Baby boomers all the way down to 15%. So let's break down that 30% of millennials that say that they're lonely. 22% of the millennials said they had zero friends. 27% said they had no close friends. And 30% said they had no best friends. 25% said they don't even have acquaintances. Now, I wonder if, not to be an a-hole here, but I wonder if they understand what the word acquaintance even means. Now, to compare, just 16% of Gen Xers and only 9% of baby boomers say they have no friends. You can't. Look, occasionally, Tamara and I have been married longer than dirt. And we have friends that find it fascinating because I married Tamara. We've been married since we were 18 years old. And I married her because I saw in her not only a beautiful woman, but a smart, independent woman. We love to be together. We love to travel together. We love to do things together. Yet we are secure enough in our relationship that she oftentimes, particularly in the summer when she doesn't have school, she runs off to New Mexico to the undisclosed location. And we've talked about what we're going to do if and ever I retire, which I probably won't, but in the case that I ever do retire, our daughter and son-in-law and our granddaughter, they want to move back to Scottsdale, the Phoenix area. And Tamara wants to spend winters with them. I might or might not. I don't really care one way or the other. I'm not saying I don't care about spending time with my granddaughter or my daughter or son-in-law. It's just that I don't have this desire to go live in Phoenix during the winter, to be a snowbird. So we were talking to friends the other day, in which we talked about, we're trying to figure out, what to do, blah, blah, blah. And Tamara's like, I'm thinking about going to Phoenix, once our daughter moves back, I'm thinking about spending, a few months in Phoenix. Mike may just be at the cabin or whatever, or because of Mike's work, he may still be up here in Denver. And they looked at us like we were nuts. In fact, one of them said, they turned to me and said, "Are you okay with that?" And I just chuckled and said, "Am I okay with that?" I kind of like the alone time. Now, it can go on too long, but having a week here or there with just me and Greta the Leonberger is fun. I'm sure Tamara feels the same way. We're secure in that relationship. We also have, you've heard me talk for, 13 years on radio, and now, what's it been, like 4 or 5 months on the podcast. You've heard me talk about spheres of influence, because I think spheres of influence are important. You need to understand and identify your sphere of influence. You need to understand what it is, so that when you talk, when you speak, when you are looking for something to do, or you're wanting to bounce something off a friend, what is your sphere of influence? Who's in your network that you can reach out to go have lunch with, to go have dinner with, to bounce an idea off? Mine is huge. It's a huge sphere of influence. Don't say that to brag. It's just a matter of fact. Because of everything that I've done through my life, I have this amazing sphere of influence that I can turn to and rely upon. When I read that 30% of millennials say they have no close friends, 22% say they have no friends at all, we should not be surprised. We should not be surprised, and the Wall Street Journal is exactly right, that the common theme of these killings is the social alienation of young men that will be harder to address. And I think that part of that social alienation is social media. It's the internet. Yes, it's gaming, television. It's the way that it's the way, and I forget the origin of the word, but someone talked about back in the 60s or 70s about the cocooning of America. And I remember reading that book, dang it, I can't remember the name of it, in which they talked about how Americans would become more and more cocooned as technology advanced and made us more and more isolated from each other. I think that baby boomers have avoided that because while we're on, and look, my 87-year-old mother is technologically savvy, like I think most people her age are quite frankly jealous of her. I'm a technology addict, but I also recognize that technology is a means to an end. It's not the end of in and of itself. But for many, technology is their only connection to the outside world, and there's no human connection. I often laugh about Facebook friends. On my Facebook page, I have almost 13,000 people that like the page, and I've got a couple of thousand on my personal page that I don't even use anymore, a couple of thousand people there, and there's some names there that occasionally show up in my feed that I don't even know who they are. If that is the sole source of my friendship, I'd be in deep doo-doo. And I might actually be subjected to the social alienation of young men, except I'd be the social alienation of old farts. That is a harder issue to address. So a pox on everybody. Now, don't get me wrong. Still believe in the Second Amendment. I believe in the God-given natural law of self-defense. I will fight to the end the right to keep and bear arms as an individual right. I do not believe whatsoever in these ideas that somehow that is not a right that we need to give up. In fact, I saw a great meme over the course of the past 24 hours. And it goes like this. Anyone using their First Amendment rights on the internet to tell me the Second Amendment only covers muskets because the AR was not invented yet will get off your computer, write me a letter with a quill pen, then have that letter delivered to my house by some guy on a horse, and then and only then can we start the discussion of why you're full of crap. Well, it doesn't really say that. It says why you're wrong, but why you're full of crap. Yes, we need to advocate, protect, defend the Second Amendment against all intrusions. I maintain my position, even in light of these shootings, that there should not be required a license to conceal, carry a weapon, any more than I need a license to walk down to the corner of my street and hold up a sign and start preaching whatever I want to preach about. Don't need a license to do that. The issue of addressing the social alienation of young men is something that the left doesn't want to address. The right probably doesn't know how to address. And nobody wants to address it because it raises issues of morals, a higher authority than ourselves, the mortality of man, and what life really means. I'm not certain we can have that kind of discussion in a political atmosphere like we have today. But it is a discussion that we need to have. I'll be right back. Hey, welcome back to the podcast. Welcome back to Michael Brown Unplugged. So on Monday's podcast, I talked about how or why it is that we focus so much on these mass shootings. And I said because, one, there's a media agenda that wants to use these mass shootings to drive their political agenda. And yes, the media does have a political agenda. If you don't recognize that, your IQ must be about room temperature, or the temperature my wife keeps the house, which is well below 72 degrees. And I talked about how there are all these other deaths that are unexpected, yet never make the news. And occasionally I'll talk about the crime report from Chicago over the previous weekend. And I think the same weekend that we had the mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton, they literally sucked up all of the bandwidth and all of the airtime, all of the airwaves on television, radio, everywhere, which is why I was in such a sour mood yesterday and didn't really want to talk about it. But now, to prove my point, over the weekend in Chicago, 59 people were shot, 7 fatally shot.
She spoke just a few moments ago, Terrell, and according to new numbers from Chicago police, there were 32 shootings across the city over the weekend. As you mentioned, 59 people shot, among those 7 dead. And just a short time ago, the city's mayor said going forward, she hopes to find a different approach to tackling weekend violence that involves more than just police saturation. Investigators now processing multiple crime scenes. This past weekend, officers and emergency rooms were stretched to their limits after police say dozens of people were shot and injured and at least 6 killed in shootings across the city. This morning, Chicago police released this audio of one of the weekend's most violent shootings that took place in the city's west side at 18th and Kildare, where 1 man was killed and 7 others injured. Police say that shooting happened just 2 hours after a drive-by shooting a couple miles away in Douglas Park that left 7 wounded.
As a city, we have to stand up and do a hell of a lot more than we've done in a very long time.
Mayor Lori Lightfoot says it's time to approach this from a different perspective, with more than just law enforcement.
It's shameful. And I can't say that the things that I saw on Saturday are things that I have even had the capacity to process yet. I left this area on Saturday night feeling devastated and heartbroken, but also determined to make a difference. We've spent over the years probably hundreds of millions of dollars policing on the West Side. CPD, federal and state law enforcement, and we have barely moved the needle.
I'm going to stop her right there. Mayor Lightfoot makes a great point that I don't think she realizes the point that she's making. She points out that on the west side of Chicago, where most of these murders, shootings occurred over the weekend, again, just to reiterate, 59 shot, 7 fatally. They have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on policing. And yet, to her point, it's barely moved the needle. I think that goes back to the point the Wall Street Journal made, and that is the killings are about the social alienation of young men. And in Chicago, in particular, young black men. So you can create a police state, which they've virtually done in the south side and the west side of Chicago. They have virtually created a police state, and yet the shootings continue. And I guarantee you that if Cook County were to confiscate all of the guns that they possibly could, have whatever stupid gun buyback program they wanted to do, it wouldn't make a dent. Because it has to do with the degradation of the social fabric that keeps this country together. We have marginalized not just young black men. We have marginalized young men. We have destroyed the nuclear family. We have made it more difficult. And don't take that wrong. I understand that single fathers and single mothers can be incredibly successful raising children. But studies and science shows that they inherently do better in a two-parent family. But we don't want to address that. We don't want to talk about that. We just want to scream at each other. I'm not going to scream anymore. I'm going to be steadfast in my support of the Second Amendment and my right to not only keep and bear arms, but in my God-given natural law right of self-defense. Nobody's going to take that away from me. I could throw in except for my cold, dead hands, but I was going to try to be rational. So that's really all I have to say about the shootings. Everybody can talk about the gun show loophole. The gun show loophole is really about two guys standing outside in the parking lot trading or selling guns with each other. You're not going to be able to stop that. There's no way you can stop that. You can talk about all sorts of red flag laws, but at some point your red flag law kind of spills over into my right to be left alone, certainly spills over into my due process rights, that before you take away a constitutional right that you afford me due process. The Colorado red flag law eviscerates due process. I never even get if somebody, doesn't have to be a family member, could be one of you. If one of you just walks into the Douglas County Sheriff's Office and says, I'm a nut job, and you think that I'm going to harm myself or harm others, they're now under a legal obligation, although I don't think they'll follow through with it. I think they are under a legal obligation to take your affidavit and go to a judge and to get an order seizing me and seizing my guns. You come for me in the middle of the night. How do I know you're law enforcement? You announce your law enforcement. Am I supposed to stand there in the doorway until I see the light shining off your badge? Or do I just see the flash off your service weapon and fire to protect myself? We're going to get law enforcement killed with these dumbass red flag laws. So I just want everybody to think, I don't have the solution. I can identify the problem. The theme of the killings is the social alienation of young men that is obviously harder to discuss. But I've thrown it out there, and I want you to think about it. What would you do? I'll be right back. We all read occasionally about how many want us to be more like Europe. They want us to be like, they want us to adopt more Democrat, socialist, which is just another way of saying socialist or fascist policies. But here's an example of where in some parts of Europe, they're recognizing that they have a problem, and the solution to the problem is enhanced controls on their borders. German Interior Minister Horst Seehofer has proposed enhanced controls along the border with Switzerland because a migrant pushed a boy to his death at Frankfurt's railway station. The migrant was an Eritrean refugee who had received asylum in Switzerland. He shoved his 8-year-old boy and his mother in front of a high-speed train. The boy's mother survived, was being treated for shock. The boy's murder caused an outcry across Germany, with conservative commentators and right-wing politicians demanding tougher border controls to stop the movement of illegal and criminal immigrants. You see, the 40-year-old suspect was reportedly on the run from Swiss law enforcement. Days ahead of this incident in Frankfurt, the man had threatened a woman with a knife. The suspect was undergoing psychiatric treatment in Switzerland. The right-wing Alternative for Germany party said in a statement, it has been repeatedly evident that secure borders save lives. This incident comes just a week after a migrant from Kosovo pushed a 34-year-old woman in front of an incoming train in the small German town of Vorde. She died at the scene. German public broadcaster Deutsche Welle reported the minister's statement as follows. Germany's interior minister has told Der Spiegel, it's a magazine in Germany, that he intends to submit a plan for enhanced covert checks and brief searches of travelers along Germany's border with Switzerland. His remarks followed Monday's death at Frankfurt's main railway station, where a Swiss resident Eritrean, right? Yeah. A migrant undergoing psychiatric treatment allegedly shoved a boy and his mother in front of a moving train. The mother was able to roll to safety, but the boy was killed. The minister told Der Spiegel, I will do everything possible to arrange intelligent controls at the border, referring to Germany's 347-kilometer, about 220 miles or so, with the Swiss Alpine Republic. Now, I want you to know this is not the only deadly incident involving migrant suspects to hit the headlines in Germany in recent days. In Stuttgart, a Syrian national, described as a Palestinian in some reports, murdered a man in the street with a sword last week. Days after this boy's murder in Frankfurt, the German media remains clueless about the nature of the crime, saying it is more likely to get hit by lightning than to be a victim of such an insane crime. And it must be emphasized repeatedly, they write, that it was safer for the 8-year-old dead boy, I guess, to live in Germany. The crime numbers are at a record low. I thought we were all concerned about preventable deaths. This was a preventable death. This is no different than an illegal alien coming to the United States of America and committing an act of murder, whether it be with a gun, a knife, drunk driving, a rape, or anything else. That is a crime that would have not occurred but for the presence of that illegal alien. And now Germany's recognizing that, they've got a problem too. I don't think the establishment's worries in Germany are totally unfounded. You see, the AfD, the Conservative Party, is beginning to surge in polls ahead of next month's regional elections in the eastern part of Germany. The right-wing party is now ahead of Angela Merkel's conservative CDU in the eastern German states. And I think that this movement against these mass migrations and these mass asylum seekers is reaching a tipping point where people even in Europe are beginning to recognize that uncontrolled borders lead to a destruction of sovereignty a destruction of culture, and actually lead to death of citizens. Keep an eye on it. I'll be right back. Those of you who listen to me on a regular basis know that one of my bugaboos is the crackdown on free speech. Well, utopia must be imposed on a global basis, because if we don't impose utopia on a global basis, people are going to escape to places, where basic human rights like free speech and self-defense are still respected. You would be amazed at the number of times I get asked this question. I'd like to move away from Colorado. Where should I go where I can feel like I'm not going to be overtaxed, where my rights aren't being taken away, where I can live in liberty and freedom? And I just kind of chuckle because, I think perhaps Oklahoma, maybe Arkansas, I don't know, Kansas maybe, I don't really know. Wyoming, but Wyoming doesn't really want you. Getting a building permit in Wyoming is extremely difficult because they're trying to control growth. I don't know where to go. But people are asking that. People are asking me all the time, where can I go where basic human rights like free speech and self-defense are still respected? Well, that question is what makes the supranational United Nations so self-important, I should say. The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has just put his name to a memo on a plan to suppress free speech. Of course, it's all in the guise of hate speech. The globalist organization was vague. This is according to Big League Politics. The globalist organization was vague and unclear on what exactly they defined as, quote, hate speech, choosing instead to describe the phenomenon as, quote, any kind of communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group on the basis of who they are. In other words, based on their religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent, gender, or other identity factor. Well, then I can't talk about anybody. I can't talk about Indians, dot or feather. I can't talk about black people. I can't talk about white people. I can't talk about short people, fat people. Randy Newman is going to hell. Short people. Can't talk about short people, tall people. Can't talk about anybody. They gave some examples. I don't like it that vandals keep breaking the windows. Now just take that by itself. I don't like it that vandals keep breaking the windows. That is pejorative and discriminatory against people who identify as vandals. So needless to say, any remark critical of unlimited mass immigration is going to qualify as hate speech. Or I suppose even if I, in a moment of self-deprecation, refer to dumb white guys like me, that's probably hate speech. The United Nations, and I know I don't give a rat's ass what the United Nations does, except that it's usually a precursor of what the progressive left wants to do. The definition of hate speech in this memo is so vague that almost anything you might say could conceivably qualify, which of course is the point. Because then our overlords, once we reach the socialist utopia, or whatever kind of utopia it is, a fascist utopia, a communist utopia, a statist utopia, whatever, just utopia, okay? Whenever we reach utopia, then our overlords, because in a utopian society, you have to have somebody to make certain that, hey, you know what? We better watch what those people are saying. Well, anyway, they leave the definition of hate speech so vague that almost anything that I say would probably qualify. The other point about that is that's the way that troublemakers can be punished selectively. And the rest of the herd will then limit itself to reciting leftist talking points just so they can be on the safe side and not incur the wrath of those overlords. The United Nations, I think, believes that member nations are required to criminalize speech deemed transnational bureau weenies to constitute incitement. No doubt those bureau weenies believe that their dictates supersede the U.S. Constitution. The troubling part is there are a bunch of bureau weenies, a bunch of lefty progressives in this country that would probably like to limit the First Amendment. In fact, I've heard people say there ought to be a law against hate speech. Yeah? Well, bite me. That's probably hate speech. I'll be right back. I'm not sure exactly where you'll find this game show, but I absolutely love it. It's called the Who Was It Show. Who was it?
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Who Was It? I'm your host, Tom Foolery. We have a very special presidential edition for 300. Who said a woman enjoys intercourse with her man as she fantasizes being raped by 3 men simultaneously?
Donald Trump would definitely say something like that.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's the incorrect answer. The answer we were looking for was Bernie Sanders. What? The board is still open, so we'll head straight to question number 2. I quote, "Who the hell do we think we are that the only way a black man or woman can learn is if they rub shoulders with my white child?"
That's got to be that racist Donald Trump.
I'm sorry, that's not the correct answer. The answer we were looking for was Joe Biden.
Oh, hell no.
On to the next question. We'll make it a little easier for you guys. This candidate's father, Donald J. Blank, gave an interview detailing his family's plantation and slave ownership.
Trump.
Guys, I'm sorry, incorrect again. The answer we were looking for was Harris. Donald J. Harris, the father of presidential candidate Kamala Harris. Let's get something on the board here. Let's keep going. Which candidate lied on applications claiming minority status, was touted by their employer as a minority hire, and even went as far as submitting recipes for a cookbook, signing their name followed by Cherokee? Anybody? Any answers? Do we want to guess? Anything? Okay, here's a hint. They go by the name Chief Spreading Bull. Pocahontas? Come on. Everyone knows it was that nutcase fraudster Elizabeth Warren. You guys suck.
Presented by the Meme Corps, the Who Was It Show. Yeah, something to laugh about, right? We need something to laugh about. Hang on, I'll be right back. In the first part of the podcast, I talked about how we have the problem with these socially alienated young men. And that part of the reason I think we have socially alienated young men is because there's so much on the internet, 99.9% of which is probably just nothing more than bovine feces. That may be an exaggeration. It might only be like 98%. But nonetheless, you can't go on unless you're on a trusted site. And I'm not referring to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or any of the social media sites. But if you're reading, I don't know, for example, the Wall Street Journal, or I would even say, to some degree, even like your local newspaper. At least you know it's your local newspaper. And if you find something that's just outrageous or doesn't make any sense to you or seems to be utterly, bizarro, you can call the local editor or you can email the reporter and say, hey, what the hell is this about? Well, as we get more and more addicted to everything being online, and as technology gets better and better about faking things, you've heard about deep fakes. That's where, for example, you can superimpose on somebody as their lips are moving to make it look like and sound like they're saying something entirely different. And you can superimpose their picture or their movements onto pornography or any number of things to make it look like, I've got a video of my best friend engaging in some pornographic act with an actress somewhere. I mean, these deep fakes truly are frightening. But I want to rely upon the private sector, smart individuals, and at some point there will develop I think we will also develop technology to help us identify deep fakes because that's how the private sector works. Why do you think we continue to have the ever-evolving antivirus programs, the ever-evolving, identity hack programs? All because when somebody develops a way to lie, cheat, or steal, somebody develops a way to counter that. But Andrew Yang, who is running for president, most famously because he wants to impose a universal basic income, was cornered by a millennial and asked about what he considers most important: deep fakes.
A lot of people said you did good during the debate side. Do you feel glad?
Yeah, I feel really glad, especially after the last debate. I feel like I didn't get a chance to lay out my vision for the economy of the country. I feel like I did this time, so it's great. But
what do you think about? What do you think about? Sorry, I just want one question. Just one question. Okay. Why do you think that we need to have a news ombudsman in America?
We're just about to enter the era of deep fakes where we're not going to be able to make heads or tails of the stuff we're seeing online. And we know the Russians have already been hacking us. It's going to get worse when literally you could have a picture of me saying words, a video, and it could be something that gets doctored. So we need to start having countermeasures in place. That's what I believe in it.
Do you think it's really good to be policing the press, though, and speech?
I'm sorry, we gotta go.
Do you think it's good to be policing free speech?
Thank you. Yeah, guys, so good to see you.
Yang, is it really a good idea to be policing the press?
Thank you. The goal is to protect the American people. All right.
But isn't it, you guys are supposed to protect our rights.
You're not going to get, look, sweetheart, you're not going to get an answer. A news ombudsman. I want you to think about a news ombudsman in this vein. Let's say that we have a news ombudsman appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate, as many cabinet and sub-cabinet positions are done. The minute that you have an appointment by the president confirmed by the Senate, that is, by its very definition, a political appointee. So we're going to have a political appointee. And maybe we'll do it. We'll create the news ombudsman to be like the FBI director, because we see how well FBI directors have worked out over the last 2 or 3, right? So what we'll do is we'll give them a term of 6 years or 8 years or something so that they can go well beyond their appointment by a president. They're still political appointees. And what gives them any more capability or ability to discern fake news from real news or deep fake videos or photographs or memes than you and I have? And who is to believe that they're going to be fair in doing it? But that's kind of the general direction we're heading. Everybody wants to limit speech by calling everything hate speech. And now everybody wants I shouldn't say everybody, but at least Andrew Yang wants a news ombudsman. Because we can't be trusted to determine for ourselves whether something is fake or real. We need, and this should scare the bejesus out of you, we need the government to do that for us. Yeah, I want a government-appointed news ombudsman. I'll be right back. So it looks like we have a answer about why Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's chief of staff resigned on Friday. He's apparently under federal investigation. According to the New York Post, Sakat Chakrabarti, I don't know how you pronounce his name. You tell me. Chakrabarti. Chakrabarti. He was the architect behind AOC's rise from bartender to ball buster. He's now being investigated in conjunction with the 2 political action committees that he founded that really kind of catapulted AOC into the limelight. The 2 PACs being probed, Brand New Congress and Justice Democrats. You probably haven't heard of Brand New Congress, but I'm sure you've heard of Justice Democrats. They were both set up by her chief of staff to support progressive candidates across the country. But here's the problem. They funneled more than $1 million in political donations into 2 private companies that he incorporated and controlled according to the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, and according to a complaint filed in March. And according to the complaints back in 2016 and 2017, the PACs raised about $3.3 million, mostly from small donors that were too stupid to know what they were doing. And a third of the cash was transferred to those two private companies that have names similar to one of the PACs, Brand New Congress LLC and Brand New Campaign LLC. According to a complaint filed by Virginia government watchdog, the National Legal Policy Center, his LLCs appear to have been specifically designed to circumvent federal reporting requirements. Now, the Washington Examiner noted a few months ago that the cash transfers from the PACs run counter to AOC's pledges to increase transparency and to reduce the influence of dark money in politics. Seems to me that's exactly what they were doing. But it's AOC. I expect hypocrisy. I know I shouldn't laugh at criminals that do stupid things that hurt companies and private enterprise. And I'm not laughing at this either because it's Amazon. But I do think this is clever. And I just find it kind of funny. A 22-year-old has been arrested in an alleged scam of the largest internet retailer that totaled nearly $370,000. And what did he do? He returned packages to Amazon that were filled with dirt. James Gilbert Quarting of some place in Spain allegedly swindled Amazon by filling up the ordered items boxes with dirt, registering with the exact weight of the product. He would then receive a refund from Amazon, sell the original item, according to this Spanish newspaper. The return packages would end up sitting around in Amazon's warehouses where they aren't checked that often. The scam wasn't discovered until through a random search where somebody opened a box and discovered this is just dirt. Amazon's return policy says that items shipped from the website, including from Amazon warehouse, can be returned within 30 days of receipt. Refunds are processed in 2 business days, and customers can expect their funds to show up in their account in 3 to 5 business days. Well, I can tell you that's a lie because I ordered something from Amazon. It came. It didn't work. I got the return authorization. I took it. You can take your return, like you open something up, you throw the box and the packing stuff away, and then you realize it's broken or it doesn't work the right way or doesn't work properly. You can take it back to Kohl's. Yeah, the Kohl's department stores. And they got a little kiosk. It's way back in the back by the service department. And you just take it back. They scan your return little, QR code, and then they just take it and issue the refund. Well, it's now been like 2 weeks, and my refund hasn't shown up yet. It's only $67.94, but $67.94 will buy a boatload of Diet Cokes. Maybe I should just sent back some dirt and kept the item and sold it to one of you. $370,000 in refunds for dirt. I don't know. I just find it funny. What I don't find funny is child abuse. And child abuse can come about in all sorts of ways. And I've suggested to many of you that have grandchildren or children of your own, or perhaps kids in college or university, that you ought to occasionally find out what they're learning. Listen to this young child terrorized and, in my opinion, abused because of what he has been taught about climate change.
I just don't know if they're going to do anything. And I'm so concerned with the fact that if they're not going to change anything, then what's going to happen to humankind? What's going to happen to the whole world if no one does anything?
Oh, what are we going to... Sniff. Sniff, sniff. Sniff Coke or something. I shouldn't laugh. That's child abuse. I just don't know what's going to happen. Oh, what's going to happen if somebody doesn't do something? Oh,
humankind. What's going to happen to the whole world?
Oh, what the whole world?
If no one does anything.
If that's your child, if that is your child, counseling. I would suggest immediate counseling and therapy, and then I'd sue the school for child abuse. You may recall during the hurricanes that struck Puerto Rico that I pointed out that the corruption of state and local officials was making it incredibly difficult for FEMA to do its job. Well, now we know exactly just how corrupt and how difficult the logistics were in getting supplies necessary to help save people, particularly in the mountainous rural areas of Puerto Rico, because local officials were either stealing that stuff, hiding that stuff, or, appropriating it for their own personal use. More likely than not, selling it to somebody at a profit. We'll listen to this report.
Tens of thousands of water bottles earmarked for Hurricane Maria victims have been discovered unopened sitting in the middle of a field in Puerto Rico. Footage taken by international news agency AFP shows crates of water sitting in the middle of a private estate in Dorado, which is about 25 miles west of San Juan. A FEMA spokesman confirmed to AFP that the water bottles had been provided as part of relief for Hurricane Maria, which hit the island in September 2017. It's a scene similar to one last September when thousands of pallets of bottled water were discovered sitting on a runway in Ceiba. Large sections of Puerto Rico spent months without electricity or water after Hurricane Maria battered the American territory, leaving nearly 3,000 dead. Several news agencies, including CBS, contacted FEMA with questions about the water, including why it was never delivered to victims, and received the following statement, which correspondent David Begnaud posted on Twitter. FEMA had a surplus of water in its inventories that is now near or past their expiration dates. FEMA followed federal acquisition processes in order to dispose of the expiring water that included offers to federal and territorial governments and public auctions. FEMA has contracted to have the expired water removed and disposed. This process is underway in accordance with contract terms and is on target for September 2019 completion. Many Puerto Ricans were upset about the water and expressed their anger on Twitter, including one man who noted that people had no water to shower and were using rainwater to flush toilets. Others report gathering water from mountain springs for months. Questions about why the bottles weren't delivered to victims or how there was a surplus when the need was so great for so long in the wake of Hurricane Maria have gone unanswered.
Why doesn't somebody ask state and local officials? If you made the request, because here's how it works. Local governments make requests, in this case to the state government, but in this case to the territorial government. Once the request is made to the territorial government, it then goes to FEMA, and FEMA turns on the spigot, no pun intended, turns on the spigot for contractors to then deliver whatever that commodity is to the area that has requested it. So here's what just busts my balls about this whole thing. Why doesn't somebody go ask who requested the water? What prevented the water from getting to that local jurisdiction? That's the real question. And I think that FEMA missed the opportunity here. And I know why FEMA didn't do it, because they know that they've got enough problems in Puerto Rico as it is. But why didn't they? I'm so sick and tired of FEMA taking the blame for the corruption and ineptitude at state and local governments. And, of course, I'm also sick and tired of, non-curious journalists asking, well, wait a minute. If there was a requisition for this water, that means that somebody requested it. How come it didn't get to the point of distribution? How about somebody just asking that question? How about somebody asking that question? Hang on. I'll take a sip of Diet Coke and my FEMA water, and I'll be right back. Let's get a couple of taxpayer relief shots in. The first one comes to us from Colorado Springs.
7 times. He couldn't even see his own death card.
Outrage and heartbreak this afternoon in a Springs neighborhood. A 19-year-old man is dead after an officer-involved shooting. Right now, the El Paso County Sheriff's Office is investigating. Here's what we know today. This happened around 7 near Adams Park Saturday night. Springs police say that's when they got a call about a personal robbery with a weapon. Police then discovered 2 suspects. The sheriff's office says one of the suspects tried to reach for a gun on his waistband. That's when the officer shot at the suspect, who later died at the hospital from his injuries. The other suspect is in jail. No officers were hurt. We know at least one of the officers is on leave today. Now, we are following up on that shooting. Tonight, a vigil is scheduled for the man who died. This gets underway in the next couple of hours at Adams Park. News 5's Jessica Bretto joins us from there tonight. And Jessica, you caught up with neighbors today. What'd you learn?
Well, they tell me they're very upset. Now, last night we did hear a lot of commotion coming from behind me on Prius Road, but neighbors tell me they stayed up all through the night because they believe the man who died after being shot by an officer did nothing wrong. Now, neighbors set up a memorial for that man. They say is 19-year-old Devon Bailey. Neighbors were paying their respects all throughout the morning with emotions running high, and the situation got even more tense when police officers showed up to do some crowd control again this afternoon.
I'll leave it for the investigation. But if the 19-year-old reached for a weapon in his waistband, the officer did the right thing. But we'll see what the investigation shows. The next one comes to us from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. The GBI is investigating a fatal officer-involved shooting that occurred Saturday afternoon in a Loganville shopping center. Agon Andrew Wallace, 25, was killed after he allegedly tried to flee from the popo and pulled out a knife on an officer, according to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. The agency said Wallace was wanted on charges of kidnapping, aggravated assault, aggravated stalking. 2 Brazelton cops were trying to track him down near the Kroger shopping center just before 3 p.m. The officer spotted the man's car in the parking lot, made contact with him. Wallace tried to run away, resisted arrest. An officer tackled him, and during the altercation, Wallace tried to draw 2 knives from his pockets. An officer pulled out his gun, fired at the man. He was taken to the Gwinnett Medical Center where he died from his wound. 2 knives were found at the scene. I guess thugs are never going to learn. Don't take on the cops. You know, here's the lesson, too. Even if you think you're in the right and you think you did nothing wrong, wouldn't it be better to sort it out in the courts rather than try to sort it out in the streets? I don't know. Just asking. Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. You know the deal. You can get the podcast wherever you can get podcasts now. We continue to get on more and more platforms all the time. And you know the deal about following me on social media. You simply go to michaelbrowntoday.com. michaelbrowntoday.com. And all of the links for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, they're all right there at michaelbrowntoday.com. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you tomorrow.